Hello, everybody. Welcome. This is the HLPF side event on territorial approaches for inclusive and resilient food systems. Now, territorial approaches to development have been discussed for a long time, but the last 10 years have seen a revival, convergence, and acceleration of a variety of systemic approaches, initiatives, and partnerships related to territorial development. Territorial approaches must not be confused with the approaches applied in integrated rural development projects, which emerged in the 1970s and a long time ago. No, instead, territorial approaches of governance to food systems encompass multi-sectoral, multi-actor approaches representing valuable operational and spatially anchored ways to understand and address the complexity of structural, economic, social, and environmental transformations. So that all sounds quite abstract, but effectively, the territorial approach to food systems is really about how, as countries develop, and in particular as developing countries grow, but also in developed countries too, you can mix the urban and the rural, and you can build the food systems to the service of humanity, providing decent nutrition and making sure that when one looks at food value chains, one is also taking into account the nutritional value chain, the rural urban connections, and providing a good diet for all in rural and urban areas. And this can really only happen through a territorial approach to a food system. I think the COVID-19 pandemic has also illustrated this to some extent, because we have seen a pushback against some of these global supply chains and a new look at how we can look at the closer than the nearer environment in terms of our management of our affairs, including food systems. So this current side event will highlight the multi-sectoral and multi-level and multi-actor natures of the approaches and confirm the role of subnational governments, regional organizations, as well as national governments that have enabled territorial approaches in the context of local food systems. Because of course, the key element to a territorial approach is involving the local government, the subnational government, the regional, provincial government, etc. And this is very important when one thinks of cities, city governments, mayors, district governments, etc. Food and food systems are not the first thing that comes to mind. Perhaps housing, perhaps roads, perhaps public transport. But in fact, in an increasingly urbanized world, the interface between local governments and food systems is becoming critical, both across the spectrum. This is true as much as where we are sitting here in the United States, where there are severe issues of malnutrition, as it is in parts of the developing world, where there are also issues of poor nutrition. So it's very important that local governments connect with the food, with food systems. The COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted fragile food systems and undermined economic opportunities. And as I mentioned, the local experiences and responses to the pandemic have underscored the importance of this integrated and inclusive planning and accelerated interventions across the rural-urban continuum that I've been referring to strengthen the resilience of food systems. So in line with the Decade of Action, the Local 2030 Initiative, and the UN Food Systems Summit, this event aims to elevate and exchange innovative solutions that regions, countries, and cities are applying towards strengthening food systems, and particularly the multi-level governance aspect of food systems, whilst promoting territorial governments and fostering local, inclusive, and resilient food systems. The event focuses on SDG 2, but it's relevant, of course, to SDGs 1, 5, 8, 11, and 17. So it's relevant across the spectrum. And this session is organized by the United Nations Capital Development Fund. My name is David Jackson. I'm Director of Local Development Finance at the UN Capital Development Fund, together with UN Habitat, FAO, and it's supported by OECD, UNEP, and United Cities and Local Governments. And we're very grateful, of course, to the Government of Uganda and the Government of Spain in sponsoring this event and bringing it to the table at the HLPF in order to increase our understanding of the territorial approaches as a means to promote inclusive, resilient food systems to better cope with food insecurity and adapt the COVID pandemic response of member countries. And I think it's quite important in closing that we have the government of Uganda and the government of Spain, a government from a European Union country, a government from a country at the heart of Africa, and really looking at both countries facing different development challenges, but both countries looking at the territorial approach to nutrition, the territorial approach to food security, the territorial approach to food systems, with multi-level government involved in that as a way of increasing the resilience and bettering the availability of food to their populations. So we're going to begin with a video that has been recorded by the Ugandan minister, and I would like to ask the video to be played now, please.
I'm privileged to participate in this summit on behalf of the Cabinet Minister of this local government in the Republic of Uganda, Honorable Raphael Magezi, who is out on official duty. My name is Businge Victoria Rusoke, the Minister of State Local Government, to present in this summit. The event title, Territorial Approaches for Inclusive and Resilient Food Systems. Your Excellencies, Honorable Ministers from the Member States, Heads of United Nations agencies and programs, representatives from the international organizations and development partners, ladies and gentlemen. Uganda is privileged to join the rest of the world in this summit to consider and reflect on how to foster territorial approaches for inclusive and resilient food systems. Uganda is one of the countries operating a decentralized system of government where the subnational governments play a very critical role in building inclusive and resilient food systems. Statistics show that in 2019, 8.9% of the global population, almost 690 million people, were unnourished, and that the African continent alone had close to 250 million hungry inhabitants, representing nearly 1/5 of Africa's population. Ironically, Africa has 60% of the world's arable land. The key drivers to this quagmire include climate variability, limited agricultural technology, poor land use patterns, civil conflicts, which have led to 2 million refugees in January 2021 in the Great Lakes region alone, pest invasion, and lately the COVID-19 pandemic. In Africa, the pandemic has led to increased hunger in population living in the urban and peri-urban areas. Limited use of appropriate agricultural technology leads to low productivity, coupled with low scale of production, with an estimated 80% of the farmland in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia being under smallholder on up to 10 hectares of land. There is also high dependence on rain-fed agriculture, low levels of value addition, less organized marketing, inadequate agricultural financial services, poor feeder road networks, poor as well as inadequate storage and processing facilities. The solutions to these problems can partly be addressed through the subnational structures of government if they are well-oriented and resourced to do so. There is overwhelming evidence that subnational governments can best contribute to the improvement of the food security systems and resilience through the following efforts. Number 1, providing agricultural extension services involving farmer training, pest and disease control, provision of high-quality inputs and seeds. 2, provide linkage between the agricultural research institutions and the farmers, thus facilitating technology transfer. 3, creating and observing land management approaches that will protect arable land and minimize fragmentation. On this, government is doing a lot, spearheaded by our president, to discourage fragmentation. Supporting farmers and communities to partner with the private sector systems in enhancing food production and processing, thus stimulating increased production in the localities. Number 5, regulating use of common sources such as wetlands and forests to curb encroachment and to ensure sustainable use. As the African saying says, the forest not only hides man's enemies, but is full of man's medicine, healing power, and food. 6, enforcing household food security programs, as well as running school feeding programs. Number 7, facilitating technologies to reduce dependence on rain for agriculture. Here in Uganda, we are emphasizing irrigation schemes from the lowest level to commercial farming. Number 8, promoting practical soil conservation to restore soil fertility by minimizing erosion and pollution, notably with plastic waste. And lastly, number 9, raising male participation to supplement the female effort in food and security nutrition. It is my sincere hope that as we deliberate on the territorial approaches for inclusive and resilient food systems, we will learn lessons from each other, which will later apply to ensure sustainable availability of safe nutrition food for all. I want to thank the organizers of this summit and wish you fruitful deliberations. Again, greetings from my Cabinet Minister, the Minister of Local Government in the Republic of Uganda, Honorable Raphael Majezi, for God and my country.
Well, thank you, Honourable Minister Victoria Rusoki, who is the Minister of State and the Member of Parliament for Gabriel in Uganda. And I think that was a really nice introduction, the role of the local governments highlighted. And I also like the point made about, you know, seeing nature as our friend, not something always to be tamed, but something that really sustains us. And that brings in the element of urban farming, which we may touch on later on, and the ways in which a much more holistic approach to nature and biodiversity with regard to food systems. So now I'd like to hand the floor to Dr. Gabriel Ferreiro, Ambassador at Large for Global Food Security from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Spain.
Thank you, David. And Honorable Minister, Excellencies, dear colleagues and friends, good afternoon. Allow me first to commend the Government of Uganda for your leadership taking the lead on convening this side event together with my government, organized with UNCDF, UN Habitat and FAO. Well, David, as you mentioned, indeed, both Uganda and Spain, we share a very strong territorial, decentralized structure in our country, and we are strong believers on the potential of our local and territorial potential as the basis of our sustainable development. It's a true honor to share with Uganda this side event. Well, before continuing, I understand that there's interpretation services available, so with your permission, I will now shift to Spanish to deliver my remarks. Queridos participantes, quisiera comenzar con una muy breve reflexión en mi intervención. Las personas no vivimos nuestras vidas en sectores, ni en ministerios en las capitales, ni en un ODS concreto o en otro. Las personas vivimos la realidad de manera naturalmente integrada. Y esto se produce en comunidades interconectadas, en pueblos, en ciudades de todos los tamaños, en espacios en los que establecemos relaciones sociales y económicas, donde compartimos una historia específica, unas tradiciones, un patrimonio cultural que definen una identidad local propia. Las personas no vivimos en sectores, vivimos en espacios territoriales. En España, a efectos prácticos, consideramos un territorio como un área compuesta por un agroecosistema, un paisaje común articulado en una red de comunidades, de ciudades vinculadas a este agroecosistema, muchas veces definido por la orografía, por una cuenca fluvial, otras veces por una vía de comunicación, por un corredor productivo, por una comunidad indígena o por un espacio protegido. Habitualmente entendemos los territorios como comarcas formadas por varias municipalidades, por ciudades de varios tamaños en red. A diferencia de las ciudades consideradas de manera aislada o de la agricultura cuando la vemos como un sector o de los alimentos como un mero producto, es en los territorios urbanos rurales donde se materializa la integralidad de la Agenda 2030. Es en los territorios donde conviven la producción, el procesado, el transporte, el consumo de alimentos, de productos primarios, con los ecosistemas y con los recursos naturales. También, lamentablemente, con las formas más extremas de pobreza, de exclusión y de desigualdades, que sufren con mayor intensidad e incidencia precisamente los productores y productoras a pequeña escala en el medio rural, que producen el 80% de los alimentos consumidos mundialmente. Los territorios, por otro lado, están indivisiblemente, como decías, David, unidos a las grandes ciudades, tanto localmente como globalmente, por múltiples, yo llamaría conectores o interconectores, que requieren considerar de manera integrada lo que tradicionalmente en el fomento del desarrollo económico hemos considerado o concebido como realidades desconectadas, cuando no contrapuestas. El campo frente a la ciudad, el atraso frente al progreso, la pobreza del campo frente a la oportunidad de la ciudad, la agricultura frente a la industria, el pasado frente al futuro. Y de entre estos conectores esenciales están en primer lugar, sin lugar a duda, los sistemas agroalimentarios. Los sistemas agroalimentarios han configurado históricamente cada territorio y sus relaciones con las ciudades, también con la globalización. Sin embargo, no es este el único conector. Los territorios proveen a toda la sociedad de bienes públicos esenciales: la biodiversidad, la recolecta y conservación de agua, la captación de energías limpias, el paisaje, la captura de carbono. Todos ellos, a su vez, que coexisten en los territorios. Es por ello que la adopción de un enfoque o de una aproximación territorial a los sistemas agroalimentarios y al desarrollo sostenible, para nosotros debe suponer en realidad un nuevo contrato social entre todas las partes, entre lo rural y lo urbano, entre lo urbano y lo rural como una sola unidad, entre los territorios y las grandes ciudades. Esto es, considerar el territorio y todos sus habitantes y actores sociales como una célula básica, como la célula básica del desarrollo sostenible, como sujeto y no como objeto, como un actor o agente, y no solo como un receptor o un productor pasivo. Claro, ¿qué significa hacer realidad este nuevo contrato social? ¿Qué significa para nosotros hacer efectivo un enfoque territorial en la práctica? Bueno, yo lo resumiría en establecer un entorno habilitante y los incentivos y el apoyo necesario para que los territorios puedan hacer emerger todo su potencial endógeno y que su contribución al desarrollo sostenible sea puesta en valor y además remunerada por el conjunto de la sociedad, globalmente y a nivel nacional. Y este entorno habilitante, a mi juicio, tendría que tener por lo menos 4 elementos. En primer lugar, diseñar las políticas top-down, las políticas sectoriales, políticas macro, desde una perspectiva, desde unas lentes territoriales. Es decir, diseñar las políticas, evidentemente la agrícola y la alimentaria, pero no solo, también la de protección social, la de salud, la de educación y la vinculación con las escuelas, como ha mencionado la ministra, desde la perspectiva territorial y abriendo desde su formulación el espacio para su adaptación a cada contexto territorial según la realidad de cada territorio y con la participación de los actores del territorio. Y con un clarísimo foco en el apoyo a esos articuladores de los territorios y muy en primer lugar la agricultura familiar y a pequeña escala. Un segundo elemento, movilizar una gobernanza inclusiva del proceso de desarrollo en los territorios a través de espacios, de plataformas de concertación con la participación de las comunidades y de los actores del territorio. Y para ello hacen falta marcos legislativos nacionales y financiación de estos procesos, que por otro lado son de un coste muy bajo. Tercer elemento, facilitar la territorialización o localización de los ODS en los territorios, y esto se hace a través de empoderar los territorios para generar su visión compartida, su estrategia y sus prioridades y sus capacidades. Un proceso esencialmente de abajo arriba, esencialmente bottom-up, donde las autoridades locales tienen un liderazgo esencial. Y por último, el cuarto elemento, articular los diferentes niveles de gobierno, lo has mencionado David, en una gobernanza multinivel, para que los procesos top-down y bottom-up se encuentren y se refuercen mutuamente. Termino mi intervención con una última reflexión. Como decías, David, estamos asistiendo mundialmente al reconocimiento de la centralidad del enfoque territorial para los sistemas agroalimentarios sostenibles y también para el conjunto de la Agenda 2030. Quizás es el momento de consolidar este movimiento social para el desarrollo territorial y desde los territorios a escala. Quizás en el contexto de la cumbre sobre sistemas agroalimentarios y en su desarrollo posterior sea un espacio apropiado para ello. Y quizás sea también el momento de proponer quizás una plataforma mundial para la financiación del desarrollo rural-urbano con enfoque territorial que aglutine los instrumentos, las iniciativas que están relativamente desconectadas a nivel internacional, incluyendo las instituciones financieras internacionales, los bancos regionales y del sistema de desarrollo de las Naciones Unidas, donde encontramos organismos como el tuyo, como David, como UNCDF, como UN Habitat y como otros que están realizando un trabajo innovador para hacer realidad este enfoque, incorporando la financiación al apoyo de los procesos de los territorios. Nada más, muchísimas gracias de nuevo, David, y gracias por la invitación.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Gabriel Ferreiro, for that very inspiring presentation on behalf of the government of Spain. And I think it's critical what you're saying. If one thinks about it, the global conventions, the UNFCCC, the Climate Convention, the carbon impact, the the UNCCD, the soil desertification convention, and then the biodiversity convention. So carbon, soil, and land degradation and biodiversity all can be measured most effectively on a territorial approach, plus the nutritional angle. So a territorial approach to food security, a territorial approach to food systems, covering urban and rural from this territorial approach enables you not just to look at the question of food, the question of the carbon impact, the soil degradation impact, and the biodiversity. And all of this is critical to our survival on the planet, including the biodiversity. So I think it's time now for this approach. And the old approach of monocropping global supply chains is not really sustainable in terms of the survival of the human race, to be quite frank. So, I mean, without getting alarmist, but I think that is the case. So we have to be really ambitious in taking this agenda forwards. And so now I think it's time to learn from some experience of territorial approaches to food systems and looking at how multi-level governance for the promotion of sustainable and territorial food systems and healthy diet has moved forward, including the financing element. And the next speaker is a dear friend, engineer Paul Kasuli Mukasa from the Ministry of Local Government, Uganda, and he's representing the Permanent Secretary, Ben Kumamanya, who could not be with us today. So welcome, Paul. Really nice to see you again, and really intrigued to hear what you're going to say about the way that Uganda has been addressing this issue. Over to you, Paul. Paul, we cannot hear you. You may be on mute. So I suggest what we do while we wait for Paul, he may have some technical difficulties, is we move to the second speaker in this segment, who is Mr. Fabio Sousa, the Manager of Strategic Partnerships at Camões, which is the Portuguese cooperation agency. So Fabio, the floor is yours. And if Amadou, you could see if we can get Paul back online. Over to you, Fabio.
Yes, thank you, David. A bit earlier than I expected, but let me first start by showing the Portuguese Development Agency appreciation to the organizers of this event, and also to the governments of Spain and Uganda for sponsoring it. Thank you so much. I will try to speak briefly on the design of governance mechanisms, which is one critical building block for territorial governance, because if we are to achieve the strengthening of urban-rural food systems linkages towards sustainability of food systems, and also have better nutrition outcomes in local communities, we definitely need to invest more in the design of governance, make it effective, especially on encompassing the vulnerable population participation and their voices and needs. But how are we bringing all these stakeholders to the table? How can we effectively contribute to multi-stakeholder, multi-level governance, which we all agree it is critical to move forward the agenda of territorial food systems? Well, I bring up a couple of examples from our current interventions, interventions supported by Camões. This is the case of the Community of Portuguese-Speaking Countries Food Security and Nutrition Strategy and its governance system, which we have been supporting for a while now. And the second case is a large EU-funded program in Angola, co-managed by Camões. One is a pure governance mechanism, and the other one is also an early warning system. So let me go briefly to, but first let me briefly explain the composition of the Community of Portuguese-Speaking Countries. It has 9 member states, for those who are not familiar with it. It is an intergovernmental organization in 4 continents, and it has a food security and nutrition strategy since 2011. And this strategy has a territorial approach to food security and nutrition, and also acknowledges the right to adequate food. So they had an insight on this subject and on these priorities very early, and I also wish to greet them for this. The strategy has 3 operational priorities, and the first one is governance. The second is the social protection and nutrition of the populations, and the third is support to family farming. Now, the strategy has governance as its first priority, and rightly so, because this is not a very easy step to make towards territorial approaches to food systems. It is not without challenges, and it is interesting to have a more focused look on how they address this issue. And so this is what I would like to bring to you. It is a mechanism in with 2 pillars. The first one is a bottom-up approach with member states national councils on food security and nutrition. These are headed by the prime ministers or the ministers of agriculture, but they have a very inclusive composition. They are composed of 50% members of civil society, and the other 50% are government and public institutions. Now, the civil society side of the council is very interesting on its composition, because it has about 80% of smallholders and family farming associations, organizing food security and nutrition networks, and the remaining 20% of the seats are divided between commercial farmers and the academia. The universities are also part of the council. On a higher level, on the level designed for the top-down implementation of policy recommendations, we have the Community's Food Security and Nutrition Council, bringing together the representatives of all national security councils, and headed by the heads of state, thus giving a maximum political visibility to push forward this agenda. So what I would like to highlight here, perhaps to sum up, is we find this a very effective multi-level governance framework, because on the one side it is based on bottom-up, and on the other side on high-level dialogue platforms, and both are formal and lasting. What I mean with this is they are not ad hoc constituted; they are effectively permanent and continue to do their work after the meetings. Now, the second example, perhaps to bring the side of operational early warning systems to the mechanisms of governance. This is implemented in a European Union project we are co-managing with the FAO, with UNDP in Angola. It is a very large project with 65 million euro from the European Union budget, and it is designed to support resilience in the semi-arid region of the south of Angola, which is very affected by climate change and by food insecurity and nutritional problems. What is innovative here is that we have a governance mechanism with a food security and nutrition early warning system embedded into it. We have supported the implementation of a food security and nutrition information system, which is based on the collection of climate data, food production data, regular surveys to rural households, and also nutritional surveillance. And this data is discussed then on a regional level, a subnational level, which is being designed in parallel with the discussions of the national strategy for food security and nutrition, and should have a composition joining local and regional authorities, and also the representatives of family farmers. And then there should be a second level of civil and political coordination, working together with this first level, which is the National Council on Food Security and Nutrition, which I mentioned earlier, and the CPLP example. So what we think this will provide is, of course, a wider social participation and better tools also to gather data from multiple sources and multiple stakeholders. And it should help decision makers to close the information gaps and make early and better informed decisions to push forward the territorial governance of food systems. Now, to try to sum up, what practices would we like to highlight? I would highlight three ideas. The first one is that the bottom-up governance frameworks work to strengthen urban-rural linkages and effective social integration. The other one, on policy content side, we have been supporting family farming, adapted and sensitive soils and ecosystems farming, along with economic diversification, and a mix of social policies to empower these local communities and to rebalance power between urban and rural areas, which is a paramount concern when we address the issue of territorial governance. And the third remark I'd like to finalize with is that we see that empowered rural stakeholders are a good entry point on the reorientation of natural resources management and food production that we wish to achieve. And I think this is a good vision to move forward. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share.
Well, thank you so much indeed, Fabio Souza. That was a very substantive intervention, and I think I surprised you because I jumped two spots down the agenda rather than one. So apologies from my side for bringing you in a little bit soon. But I think you have really put some very substantive issues on the table there. And in the meantime, Paul has contacted me to say that he's having connection difficulties. So I hope we'll get the statement from the Ministry of Local Government and be able to read it out or find a different way of presenting it later in the program. So you've set a very high bar, Fabio, very detailed and very comprehensive and thoughtful. And I'd like now to revert to the agenda, of course, and go to Mr. Jamie Morrison, Director of Food Systems and Food Safety Division at FAO, to talk about the FAO approach to this topic. And I think trying to keep it as a conversation, maybe if you could also respond to some of the points that have been mentioned so far, so we can keep the conversation flowing and hopefully come to some good outcomes at the end. Over to you, Jamie Morrison.
Thank you, David, and great actually to hear some practical examples of the way in which territorial approaches are being implemented in practice, because I think it adds substance to what I'm going to say in my brief intervention. So, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, good afternoon. I think as we've heard from many of the interventions so far, there is an increasing consensus that territorial approaches can provide a useful tool for achieving more efficient, inclusive, resilient and sustainable agri-food systems. These approaches allow governments to reinforce multi-level governance architecture that is so urgently needed to support the transformation of our agri-food systems, and allow them to play out their role in supporting countries' achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Not just Sustainable Development Goal 1 and 2, but across the 17 goals. In particular, I think the approaches help to increase levels of policy and program coherence between different decision-making processes. We have tended to work in a very siloed manner. And I think when we look at territories, and particularly at the work of local governments, we see these silos being broken down quite rapidly, and territorial approaches being used to help that process of silo breaking, allowing decision-making to be more joined up, not only across different sectors at different spatial levels, but also between scales of action, between global governance, regional, national, and local levels. And I think given the many examples we see globally of sometimes not that well aligned national and local level governance structures, I think these approaches can really help to illuminate how we move forward in that respect. Over the last couple of years, or well, more accurately, I should say 16 months, we've learned a lot from our observation of the responses that local governments have made to the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. Many local governments, municipalities in particular, have played a major role in despite limited access to financial resources and these often constraining policy frameworks. And we see many examples globally where local governments have facilitated a continuing access to safe and nutritious food for those who have been particularly disrupted by the pandemic. Territorial approaches can also help in anchoring rural development, food security and nutrition strategies on specific territorial assets, building on the interdependencies between rural and urban communities, acknowledging the role of cities and local governments in redirecting agri-food systems within their territories. David, at the beginning, you mentioned one of the sort of results of one of the impacts of the pandemic has been a greater focus on local production for local consumption, as one example. And here we see the rural-urban linkages as being particularly important. Municipalities, urban areas will currently house a proportion of the global population who consume 70% of food which is produced globally. So clearly the actions that those consumers take has a major impact on the opportunities provided for local producers. And if we can strengthen those linkages, urban-rural linkages, through the adoption of these territorial approaches, I think we'll go a long way to addressing some of these challenges. Turning to the Food Systems Summit process, because I think here again, we've seen territorial approaches being identified as an important overarching framework that can help to address the interconnected challenges which are intrinsic to many agri-food systems. And as the summit process moves from the identification of solutions to their operationalization in the context of pathways which are being developed at the national level through Food Systems Summit dialogues, territorial approaches can provide a really important conceptual and operational framework for promoting greater sustainability and inclusivity, in particular in food system transformation. As FAO, we have a wide range of experience in working with territorial approaches in different ways and with different partners, from participatory community-led approaches towards national and supranational governance frameworks to full-scale territorial analysis to help in the identification of investment opportunities. We've been working with a large, broad range of partners, including the European Commission, CIRAD, GIZ, BMZ, AFD, UNCDF, NEPAD, OECD, on the Territorial Perspectives for Development, TP4D Alliance since 2018. And we're also working within our own programs to further integrate landscape and territorial approaches, for example, in the context of the Global Environment Facility programs, and also to incorporate territorial approaches into several initiatives, including our Urban Food Agenda, which we launched a couple of years ago, community and individual empowerment, public procurement schemes, school feeding programs, nutrition-sensitive social protection programs, and food system governance. So FAO, I think, is in a very good position to continue to provide technical support to its members and other relevant partners to help to operationalize territorial development approaches for the promotion of inclusive and sustainable agri-food systems. Thank you, David.
Well, thank you so much indeed. That was a very comprehensive presentation, and I think the fact that FAO is so committed to this topic is a really positive signal. So thank you very much indeed for that, Jamie. And we're really looking forwards to working with you and to taking this agenda forwards. And, you know, they say that everything happens for a reason. So I think the way the agenda has shaped out now is quite nice, because we can go to two experiences from the field after having these relatively high level presentations. So we'll go first to Diane Bassa, the Deputy High Commissioner Food Security from the Prime Minister's Office in Mali. And then after that, I will go to Jennifer Bukaki from UNCDF, who will read out the presentation of Paul Kasuli, who was not able to make it due to connectivity reasons. So I think it'll be nice now to get a bit of reality from the field following these high-level interventions. And Diane Bassa, Deputy High Commissioner Food Security, Prime Minister's Office, Mali, the floor is yours. If there is also a connectivity problem in Mali, may we go to Jennifer? Jennifer, are you in a position to read out Paul's comments?
Attendez.
Oh, okay.
Je crois qu'il y a un problème d'activation de mon micro. Ok, d'accord. Donc, bonjour à tout le monde. Bonjour à tout le monde.
We can hear you loud and clear. Please, the floor is yours.
Donc, c'est un plaisir. Ah, d'accord. C'est un plaisir pour moi d'intervenir dans cette discussion pour partager avec vous l'expérience du Mali en matière d'approche territoriale de la gestion de la sécurité alimentaire. Donc, ce programme pilote appelé communément ici au Mali le PLIAM, le programme de lutte contre l'insécurité alimentaire et la malnutrition, a été un programme pilote pour nous à cause de son caractère multi-acteur, puisqu'il y avait des agences des Nations Unies qui intervenaient. Il y a l'administration publique, le secteur privé, les ONG, les collectivités. Surtout, le tout était focalisé sur les collectivités pour mettre en place une politique de proximité de gestion de la sécurité alimentaire. Donc, le programme au Mali a été financé par le FBSA, qui est une coopération belge, à travers laquelle l'initiative renforçait la collectivité territoriale à différents niveaux pour permettre à chaque maillon de jouer sa partition dans la gestion de la sécurité alimentaire. Donc, la démarche se focalisait sur le rôle décentralisé des collectivités pour prendre en compte l'ensemble des dimensions de la sécurité alimentaire. Parce qu'il y a des activités qui portaient sur la production, d'autres sur la nutrition en termes de prévention et récupération des enfants malades. Il y a l'accès à l'eau potable, il y a l'accès aux ressources pour améliorer la diversification alimentaire. Donc, sécurité alimentaire. Donc, il fallait le coordonner au niveau national par le commissariat à la sécurité alimentaire et la direction des collectivités pour que chaque maillon des collectivités puisse jouer son rôle. Les collectivités, en effet, l'approche au SAN était fondée d'abord sur l'amélioration de la gouvernance locale, de la sécurité alimentaire, d'abord pour la tenue régulière de toutes les instances de gouvernance et de décision de la SAN. Ensuite, il y avait un programme de renforcement institutionnel et aussi technique pour les aider à planifier, pour les aider à identifier les priorités, pour les aider à négocier les financements nécessaires, à les suivre et aussi à les évaluer. Également, l'amélioration de la coordination à tous les niveaux des intervenants permettait également à la commune d'être plus efficace dans les services rendus aux populations à la base. Donc, suite à la mise en œuvre de ce programme au Mali, nous nous sommes engagés dans la coalition des pays qui ont servi à faire la publication FAO, UNCDF, OCDE sur l'approche territoriale de sécurité alimentaire. C'est pourquoi, à travers le ministre commissaire à la sécurité alimentaire, nous étions à Milan en 2015, nous étions à Paris en 2016, pour discuter en tout cas de l'expérience du Mali en matière d'approche territoriale. Donc, quand nous avons capitalisé cette expérience au bout de 5 années de fonctionnalité, nous avons tiré les enseignements et ça nous a permis de concevoir un programme pilote appelé Programme de renforcement du dispositif national de sécurité alimentaire. Et cela, cette fois-ci, en partenariat non seulement avec la coopération suisse, mais également d'autres PTF se sont engagés pour soutenir à grande échelle l'initiative commencée par la coopération suisse en matière de renforcement des collectivités pour la prise en charge de la sécurité alimentaire de proximité. Donc, l'intervention à travers le programme de renforcement des systèmes alimentaires était focalisée sur une composante qui appuyait les collectivités et cela en soutien avec l'UNCDF. C'était dans le cercle de Nioro du Sahel et de Nara. Tous deux se trouvaient dans une zone vulnérable dans la première région avec un programme d'intégration dans le cadre du développement décentralisé. Donc, le rôle prépondérant des communes dans cette approche de la sécurité alimentaire expliquait la forte implication de la Direction générale des collectivités territoriales qui a assuré la tutelle de cette composante. Entre-temps, la coordination qui permettait une réponse synergique des différents volets était confié au commissariat à la sécurité alimentaire en tant que chargé des politiques de sécurité alimentaire au Mali. Donc, il y avait beaucoup de défis qui consistaient d'abord à diversifier les sources de financement, non seulement pour capter ceux qui étaient publics, mais en plus des financements publics, il fallait aider les collectivités dans la transformation des systèmes alimentaires nécessaires, à la fois financés par le public, mais également soutenus par le secteur privé. Donc, nous, en tout cas, à travers l'expérience au Mali, nous pensons que cette approche territoriale est nécessaire pour la mise en œuvre des politiques de sécurité alimentaire décentralisées, puisqu'il permet de connecter le niveau national au niveau local et au niveau proximité au niveau de la commune. Et il renforce les capacités de chaque acteur. Et dans les collectivités, l'expérience a prouvé qu'il y a des projets et programmes qui dépassent la limite d'une commune. Cette approche permet de mettre en relation une ou deux communes ou deux cercles pour les ouvrages et les investissements qui vont au-delà d'une collectivité. Et tout cela est soutenu par le niveau national dans une cohérence synergique. Donc voilà brièvement l'expérience. Et s'il y a des questionnements, je crois que je pourrais intervenir éventuellement pour donner d'autres détails relativement à la mise en œuvre de ce programme. Merci pour votre patience.
Well, thank you so much indeed, Diane Bassa, Deputy High Commissioner Food Security at the Prime Minister's Office in Mali. And thank you very much for starting to introduce the topic of financing. How is the financing going to, where is the financing going to come from for the sustainable food systems? And one of the potential answers, of course, is in the conventions we spoke about earlier. You know, it turns out that 37% of greenhouse gas production is in the current way that we consume food. So that's a large amount, nearly 40% of the greenhouse gases are from the way that we're consuming and producing food right now. A territorial approach could significantly reduce that. And so these are the ways in which it may be possible to start to bring green finance, create new asset classes that will encourage a territorial approach to food security and support the public finance that is needed to also build this element in. And that's one of the things that UNCDF will be bringing to the table in our partnership with FAO, UN Habitat, and local governments and OECD and the partners around the table. How can we actually link a territorial approach to food systems to those three conventions I was talking about earlier, to other global goals, and therefore attract the kind of financing into this because of the externalities that it would bring? I think this is, it is a far more important topic than it is often given credit for. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Jennifer, who will be reading out the statement from the government of Uganda. Over to you, Jennifer. So it may be the connection problem in Uganda is general to that country. So what we'll do is, I think we'll keep the agenda moving, and the opportunity will be there at some point, we hope, before the end of the session, to hear the perspective from Uganda. Yes, Jennifer, fantastic. We have you.
Yes.
Jennifer, please.
Sorry.
Absolutely no problem at all. We're just very excited to hear the statements from the government of Uganda with regard to this topic. And of course, I know that you see them frequently, so please transmit my all of our thanks to Uganda for sponsoring this meeting. Over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you very much, David. Of course, I'll convey the greetings to all of them. This is the statement which was to be presented by Engineer Paul Kasule on behalf of the Permanent Secretary, Mr. Benjamin Kumumanya. Agriculture is the backbone of Uganda's economy, and 70% of the population is dependent on it. Subsequently, the industrial sector is very agro-based. When this sector gets any shocks, for example, excess rainfall, drought, locust invasion, pests, etc., the whole economy is affected. Now, despite its significance, the agriculture sector is still experiencing challenges of 1, low agricultural production and productivity, and 2, insufficient storage infrastructure, 3, low competitiveness for some of the products in domestic, regional, continental, and international markets, including, for example, our famous local food, the matoke, banana. And then 4, low value addition, and 5, limited access to agricultural financial services and critical inputs. And number 6, insufficient and inefficient institutions for planning and implementation of agro-industrialization. Further, despite Uganda's endowment as a regional food basket, there exist disparities in food and nutritional security across the country, with the drought and flood-prone Cattle Corridor and Karamoja regions experiencing frequent food insecurity. The Uganda National Household Survey of 2016-2017 revealed that 10.9 million Ugandans are food insecure, with 1.6 million facing acute food insecurity. Moreover, the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic has further exacerbated the situation. Smallholder farmers have faced challenges of access to agro inputs and markets due to the lockdown restrictions imposed to check the spread of the virus. To respond to these challenges, agro-industrialization program is one of the 18 prior development plan. 20 target is to increase the agriculture sector growth rate from 3.8 to 6.0%. The agro-industrialization program of the National Development Plan 3 focuses on increasing the proportion of households that sent to 80. This initiative, UN Capital Development Fund, is supporting the agro-industrialization program through to agriculture, which we call a start facility, and the LFI program. All these support efforts are aimed at supporting the small and medium enterprises to access finance, improve value addition, business development, concessional loans, and partial credit guarantees. The National Development Plan 3 also intended to increase production and consumption of micronutrient-rich foods and utilization of community-based nutrition services in smallholder households. The districts have set up mechanisms for planning and implementing interventions which ensure food and nutritional security through local economic development programs, which were initiated in Uganda by the support of the UN Capital Development Fund. They are using an integrated approach in developing responses to community needs, including building sustainable food systems and resilience against the impact of COVID-19. Previously, due to the liberalization policy, government had in the past decades been diminishing its role in food system governance in order to allow for farmer, civil society, market, and private sector-led efforts. However, with the emergence of challenges such as the impact of climate change, land degradation, natural, and the COVID-19, the role of the national and subnational governments has been amplified in order not to let communities become less resilient and more vulnerable to food and nutritional insecurity. At national level, more effort is now being placed in enacting enabling policies, providing rural financing and quality assurance, especially for nutrition and also for export. Recognizing agriculture finance as critical agenda, the government set up the Agriculture Credit Facility in Central Bank and the Microfinance Support Center to provide financing to microfinance institutions and agriculture cooperatives, savings and credit cooperative organizations, village savings and loan associations, and small and medium enterprises. The one important thing that districts are undertaking in supporting sustainable food systems is creating and strengthening community-based organizations and farmer associations. The districts are primarily responsible for provision of inputs, skills development, market linkages, and linkages to investment financing. The new service delivery projects now have a school feeding program as part of the social services being rendered. Finally, in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, nutritious foods are still considered a luxury. Many households, especially in the urban areas, are struggling to meet their basic food needs. Nutritious foods such as milk, animal protein are not on the menu in most homes. Thank you. This is the statement of the Permanent Secretary. I've tried to read it the way it is. Thank you for listening to me. Over to you, David.
Thank you so much indeed, Jennifer. Highly appreciate it. And really great that we could get that detail, that level of detail, statistical detail and understanding and appreciation of the situation on the ground, I think, from Uganda. And the government is to be commended, along with the government of Mali, for the way in which they are addressing this issue head on. So I hope we'll have a time for a small discussion. So let's quickly move through the two remaining speakers, and then we can hopefully circle back and have a very small discussion to provide something for Raf Tuts to respond to some extent in providing the closing remarks. So I'd like to go next to Aziza Akmouch, who is the head of division for cities, urban policies and sustainable development at the Center for Entrepreneurships, SMEs, Regions and Cities of OECD. And if you could try to keep your remarks relatively brief, Aziza, I would really appreciate it. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, David. I was actually entrusted with the difficult job to summarize some of the takeaways of the first interventions, and I'll certainly not do justice to the wealth of information that was shared. Many thanks to the speakers. This was really illuminating, but I've tried, based on what I've heard, to organize three main takeaways, in my view, from what we've heard so far. The first one is that I think there's a broad consensus that food systems are not only, or better say, not any longer a mere rural issue, but that they are also, if not increasingly, becoming an urban development priority. It's true that we've long seen food challenges through the lens of agriculture, and we heard from the Honorable Minister of Uganda, Victoria Busoke, the extent to which there is a very strong lens related to agriculture, but not only agriculture and rural development. It is much more complex than that, and that's also an urban issue. I think this is important to remind that one reason for that is that the world is probably no longer split between cities and rural areas. The work that we have done at the OECD with FAO, UN Habitat, World Bank, and many other organizations in relation to what we call this degree of urbanization, showed basically that 48% of the world population today lives in cities, more or less functional urban areas above 50,000 inhabitants. 24% live in clearly rural areas, and there is this in between of 28% that lives actually in towns and semi-dense areas. And I think that takes us under that first takeaway to this rural-urban connection and this idea that increasingly urbanization and related challenges will demand more integration with rural areas and food systems, and therefore food systems are an important entry point for such integration. I think the ambassador at large from Spain did emphasize this need for a new social contract between rural and urban, and that speaks to that issue. The second point that I take away from the conversation is that, as was the case in many policy areas, COVID-19 has somehow magnified territorial disparities, not only across countries, but within countries. And we've just heard that from Jennifer, reflecting on food security, territorial disparities within Uganda. And therefore, in my view, this is raising the need to better connect cities of different sizes with their rural hinterland, and food systems here as well can contribute to that. We've heard in the past decade more calls for territorial cohesion, for more balanced urbanization, a call for more win-win partnerships that no longer rely on the zero-sum logics or winner-takes-all approach between rural and urban areas, but that tap into territorial assets and attractiveness. And this is where the territorial approach matters, because this is a discourse that we've long heard, I have to say, working over the past decades at the OECD on rural policy from rural constituencies, but that we're increasingly hearing now from mayors and urban areas, because not only of the disruptions in global supply chains that we saw actually during the pandemic, and that raised the question of self-sufficiency and autonomy in many cities, including Vienna, for example, in Austria, that is telling you 4 months a year they are completely self-sufficient in terms of food security, but also because we've seen many citizens increasingly calling for proximity, local loops, buy-in, and you stressed that yourself, David, in your opening remarks, less food waste, less transport, and those concepts of the circular economy, the nature positive city, and the 15-minute city really reflect this idea that somehow many of the economic, social, and environmental determinants of food security and resilience at large come from outside the agriculture box. And I think that's an important point here. And the last message that I take from these interventions is that the long-standing experience pushing for that territorial approach to food systems, I was very pleased to hear about this 2016 report that we co-led with my colleague Stefano Marta, with many of you, has inspired a broadening basically the territorial approach to all the sustainable development goals, because all of them actually, given their holistic and interconnected nature, do require this place-based, cross-sectoral, multi-level and multi-sectoral and stakeholder approach. And I think Diane Bassa, the Deputy High Commissioner from Mali, did show the extent to which linking to water and gender and food and this multi-sectoral and dimensional approach to well-being is very important. So there is an inspirational role, I would say almost a precursor role, from the food system community in driving this territorial approach, so that we're no longer talking about the old regional development paradigm where we are subsidizing lagging regions, but we're building really on territorial assets. And I'll finish just saying this program on a territorial approach to the Sustainable Development Goals that we launched at the OECD conveys basically this idea of that shared responsibility across levels of government. We heard, and that requires actually robust governance systems, and we heard from Fabio Sousa in Camões the extent to which some of these councils can be sophisticated and well designed for that multi-level governance. We need also granular data to measure progress beyond national average, otherwise we cannot take informed decisions, and we're even sending a misleading picture of where we stand. And last but not least, we need to really see the SDGs through that territorial approach as a policy-making tool and not only as a compliance agenda. And that means they should help revisit from the ground up how we plan, how we invest, how we budget, and how we drive policy coherence. And that was the point made by James Morrison from SAO, including in terms of managing conflicting priorities and trade-offs. So thank you all very much. This was really enlightening, and we stand ready as the OECD to pursue that conversation and really leverage the food security experience for that broader territorial approach to sustainable development.
Wow, Aziza, so I can see why you were chosen to summarize the discussion, because that was excellent. A really concise summary there, and thank you very much indeed. So you've I think set a really good springboard for the remainder of this meeting, and we're going to have a micro discussion, if you like. Now, we let's see if we have time for the anybody from the floor, but we do have one discussant, if you like, who is an honorary person speaking from the floor, and that is Abdul Dayem Navi, the cooperation advisor from Nouakchott region in Mauritania. So if you could please make your comments now as a discussant, as basically the first person speaking from the floor, and we'll see if we have time for others. Diane Bassa, I do notice that your hand is up. If you would also like to speak, please indicate again, please indicate so in the chat.
Oui, bonjour.
Over to you. Yes, thank you. Bonjour.
Oui, bonjour, vous m'entendez?
Loud and clear, please go ahead.
Ah, merci beaucoup. Je vous remercie bien d'être invité à cette importante réunion. Avec ce sujet qui nous intéresse beaucoup à Nouakchott. Moi, je suis docteur en sciences économiques. Je suis conseiller chargé de coopération au niveau de la région de Nouakchott. Donc, nous, surtout après la pandémie Covid, comme vous le savez, donc tout le monde a le problème d'autosuffisance, surtout en sécurité alimentaire. Bien sûr, nous, en Mauritanie, de manière générale, le pouvoir public, c'est-à-dire, sont bien investis dans l'agriculture de manière générale. Mais vous m'entendez toujours?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear. Could everybody else please mute themselves if they are not speaking, so the interpreter can have a clear line? Thank you.
Donc, merci beaucoup. Moi, je vais essayer de partager avec vous l'une des expériences que nous avons vécues au niveau de Nouakchott, surtout qui concerne essentiellement l'agriculture urbaine. Donc, après les effets de la pandémie de Covid-19, nous avons vraiment, en Mauritanie de manière générale, et à Nouakchott, qui est la capitale, dont un tiers de la population qui habite à cette ville. Et donc, nous avons le problème d'autosuffisance, surtout en légumes, essentiellement. Le pays basé sur l'importation de légumes des pays voisins, à partir des pays voisins. Donc, nous avons initié une tranche d'un projet pilote consacré essentiellement sur l'agriculture urbaine. Donc, ce projet est en phase d'installation. Donc, nous avons deux objectifs essentiellement de ce projet. L'un, c'était d'alimenter le marché local des produits des légumes, des légumes bio surtout. Le deuxième objectif, c'est d'absorber le maximum de chômeurs jeunes, surtout les jeunes, comme notre population est à 70%.
I think the sound has gone. Yes, I think the sound has gone.
Je suis désolé pour la connexion. Vous m'entendez toujours?
Yes, we can hear you. If you could also be quite brief with your remaining remarks so that we can complete on time.
Okay. Donc, juste, je veux dire qu'à partir de cette expérience, je vais souligner deux problèmes essentiellement. Le premier, c'est le problème de financement. surtout les pays pauvres comme notre pays, les pays en voie de développement, nous avons toujours l'accompagnement financier surtout. Donc, je sollicite ici de cette occasion les bailleurs de fonds, les organisations internationales de s'investir, d'accompagner les approches territoriales de notre pays sur ce sens qui est vraiment une base et un atout pour notre pays. Merci beaucoup.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And we have arrived at a moment where we can have a kind of, I think, a quick fire session from the floor. So what I suggest we do, if anybody has been listening to this and would like to make a comment, please, type in the chat box just a couple of very quick points or comments you want to make, and we may pick on a couple of you just to say those verbally in 20 to 30 seconds, rather than having a full a full intervention. I think we can do 2 or 3 of these maybe, and then we will be able to go to Raf for the closing remarks. But what we've heard so far, I think, has been a very comprehensive discussion from around the world, and a couple of pieces of the jigsaw. How are we going to finance this territorial approach? How are we going to get acceptance for this territorial approach by other stakeholders? There was a question already in the chat box about economies of scale, and what is the counter argument to those who say that the long global supply chains and the monocropping, etc., is more efficient. I'm still waiting to see people maybe perhaps making quick points in the chat box. But something that I always like to mention is that quite a significant a feature to me is the fact that there's been studies showing that in Ghana, obesity is on the rise and poor nutrition is actually increasing again following decades in which it was decreasing, partly due to the packaging of things like biscuits in small plastic wrappers that are reaching into the populations where people were previously actually consuming food which was more nutritious. Something similar is also happening in Brazil. So it's a very interesting issue, the way that the interface between the way food is produced and consumed and the nutrition pathway. And that's where a territorial approach can begin to address those issues. I see a comment there from Adriano Campolina. So maybe if you'd like to just in maybe 20 seconds summarize what you would like, what you want to say, Adriano, over to you.
Hello, can you hear me, David?
Loud and clear.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks for the opportunity to bring my point. I was just emphasizing how important those territorial approaches are for inclusivity, sustainability in the transformation of food systems, but also pointing out that at the territory level, we also have power inequities. So therefore, it's important that we use those innovations on governance to ensure that we address the power inequities and we promote the agency of those most included. And that's not automatic, that's not natural. I think it requires a very strong orientation from the beginning to ensure that the most excluded voices are not just part of multi-stakeholder dialogue, but they are empowered sufficiently to take part on those dialogues in a transformational way. So I think the issues of agency and changing power relations and ensuring that we address structural causes of exclusion is absolutely fundamental, and I believe the territorial approach brings the best chance for that. Thank you.
Well noted, and thank you very much indeed. And now we do have a good flow of comments in the chat there. We see the good news that Mali is agreeing to share its experience with Burkina Faso and others, and this is really positive. I like the point there about no geographical barriers across urban and rural geosystems. I mean, that is fundamental. Also, the urban farming, the urban production side of things, and also the urban contribution to biodiversity is something which we have not yet spoken about, but which I think is part of this territorial approach. And how can we promote this approach has been mentioned there in terms of resources, and yeah, sustainable diets, of course, as we've been talking about, being an important entry point. And then, of course, there is the question there on the financing. And I think, I mean, I'm about to hand over to Raf now, but from the perspective of the United Nations Capital Development Fund, I mean, the financing, and we are very happy to work on innovative financing to address this. Of course, the local government finance system is one route. Fiscal decentralization and local government finance is not often associated with food systems. It's more associated with health and education to some extent, and then things like roads, municipal management, libraries, and kind of municipal services. But there is this element to it, and we've also heard that particularly in rural areas, things like agricultural extension are often supported by local governments. But I think we need to go beyond that and look at rural and urban areas and how local government expenditures can really address this issue in the more holistic way that we've been talking about. And then, of course, other ways that the financing can come is by connecting the territorial approach to food systems to the broader SDG financing agenda. I mentioned earlier the statistic that 37% of greenhouse gas emissions are derived from the way that our food is produced. That is a lot. It's as much, or it's a significant amount. It's not only about the production of energy. It's not only about clean energy. It's also about less GHG producing food systems. So that's another way you can bring that type of finance in to have a territorial approach. That we don't yet have the kind of green finance coming into this area, and that's something we can look at. Now, I'm going to hand the floor over to Raf Tutz now, who is the director of the Global Solutions Division at UN Habitat, and this is a great collaboration, Raf, and you've had I hope you've really enjoyed listening to these contributions, and the floor is yours for the closing remarks.
Thank you so much, David, for the introduction, and thanks to everyone. I mean, first of all, thanks to Uganda and Spain for sponsoring this event, and all the co-organizers, UNCDF, FAO, and OECD, who organized this event in such a brilliant way. I think we heard a lot, we learned a lot, and I'm very thankful to Aziza for have already doing such a great summary of the key points, which makes my task much easier. But I still want to raise a few elements that I find that stood out, and also more general about the pathway we are following with these territorial approaches. We are not talking about this in isolation. There are other organizations, there are other processes that thankfully are moving in the same direction, and one is a drive towards localization of Agenda 2030, stronger emphasis on local action to contribute to global goals, which fits within this agenda. And very recently, actually, the ministers, the development ministers of the G20, in their Matera communique, are emphasizing this issue of territorial action, territorial approaches to localization of the SDGs. So really, we are getting support from corners that previously would not even talk about these issues. So I think this is a positive, a very positive step. I just want to elaborate a little bit more on this topic of the peri-urban territory, which Aziza has emphasized, this area in between, which I believe is a connector and which makes sure that this territorial approach can work. But there are also a number of challenges there because these intermediate territories are often also excluded, or where the most vulnerable people live, and these transitions are not always easy to negotiate. and to make sure that this continuum which we described is working as it should work. So this is something to be on the lookout for, so that we don't, through this approach, be careful that we really address the inequalities which exist in these intermediary spaces. Also in these intermediary spaces is where intermediary cities, small towns, are very important as critical connectors. So I believe that, I think one of the speakers has used the word the social contract. We need a new social contract that looks at these. We are moving beyond an abstract discussion of territorial linkages. We're going to very concrete pathways, but to scale these, we need a social contract that can assure that these inclusive and resilient food systems are part of a just transition, and they're not seen as a separate agenda. This is part of a just transition out of the pandemic and towards 2030. So much has been said about the substance, also about the interagency engagement and the intergovernmental engagement that is necessary to move this forward. We have said a lot about multi-level governance. I think this is the beginning of this discussion about multi-level governance. We have seen it through the pandemic, how important it is, but also we need to make sure that this kind of collaboration between at least 3 levels of governments can continue as we move out of this situation. We have seen some interesting alliances working on this topic, but I think much more is required to lift this to the necessary level. And as David has said, the missing gap is the financing. We need to bring the development banks on board so that these coalitions can also be backed up with serious investment and finance. But much more learning needs to continue. And I think we can conclude that this mainstreaming of territorial governance, strengthening urban-rural linkages, and integrating it through the both development, but also the humanitarian work in different countries needs to continue to be strengthened, along with an overall approach of local and sub-regional government strengthening, which is a continuous agenda for the United Nations and for other agencies as well. So I'd like to close here and thank everyone for the engagement and their commitment to this cause, and wishing a lot of continued participation in the high-level political forum. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much indeed, Raf, and thank you everybody for joining this a very stimulating event, and I feel we're at the beginning of something which will only grow, and the discussion will continue during the parallel session on territorial governance for sustainable food systems, which will take place on the 23rd of July. So please mark your calendars for that. And this is where the strong partnership between UNCDF, the European Commission, FAO, UN Habitat, CIRAD, BMZ and GIZ, AFD, NAPAD, and OECD, who launched the Territorial Perspective for Development, this is TP4D Alliance, in 2018, will come together and to try to enhance this common understanding of territorial approaches. And I think you're right, Raf. It does go beyond food systems, this territorial approach, and it is even a broader approach to development. But food systems is perhaps one of the best entry points for it, and to really start getting people to wake up to its importance. And as we mentioned earlier, seeing these other issues, including the climate, the biodiversity, soil, and those conventions and the food systems being a vector to deliver those. I think those linkages need to be met, and that's where the finance will start to come. And then the second linkage, of course, is the linkage with local government and local government finance and the local government financial system, because that linkage is not yet made either. But when those two are in place, then you've broadened this beyond the kind of narrow food agenda, and I think that that's what we need to do. It needs to become a broader development agenda. So thank you so much. We're pretty much out of time. So there are comments in the chat box and some great links. If you know how to do it, please do save the chat. It's you'll find it very useful. Otherwise, we may, if one of the UNCDF colleagues could save the chat, we may circulate it to the participants. There's some good links there. And thank you everybody for participating in this event. Thank you so much indeed, and look forward to seeing you all and many more, I hope, on the 21st of July and at other similar events as we really put this on the agenda. And we are pioneers in this. So in that spirit, I'd like to wish you all a very good afternoon. Thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye.